Stay with this story until the last word. The turn at the end is worth the wait and will make the whole journey feel inevitable. Chapter 1, Terms of Lightness. This account is told by a woman who knew them both, close enough to read the handwriting on their coffee cups, far enough to see the patterns they missed. She watched two lives cross in a city that prizes momentum over meaning, and she knew from the first moment that their casual oath would end up anything but. Mara moved east with a suitcase that creaked and an ambition that didn't. She'd left a watercolor skyline drying on her Los Angeles floor and took a job in a Brooklyn creative studio where the deadlines were fast and the coffee tasted like decisions. Theo was already there, a product strategist fluent in 2 languages, data and charm. He could turn a list of numbers into a map of desire, and he had a way of listening that made the room lean toward him. They met because the city needed a campaign and the campaign needed a story. He had the pitch, she had the palette. The day they were introduced, they traded jokes about the company's glass doors, how they looked like sincerity but smudged easily. That was the way they began, clear, reflective, and already marked by fingerprints. They became companions quickly, the kind that trade playlists and confessions with equal ease. On their first late night in the studio, while the cleaning crew hummed and the decks rendered, Mara traced lines on a napkin and said, "People keep trying to name things before they've grown." Theo nodded and replied, "Names are how we pretend we're not scared." They smiled at each other as if the room had been listening. What they didn't tell each other yet, Mara feared beginnings because in her life they were always decorations hung over exits. Theo feared endings because he had never learned to leave before being left. Every new friendship felt like a room with a trapdoor. So before summer folded into itself, they wrote terms around their closeness, a satire at first, and then a pact with gravity. Chapter 2, The Playbook of Boundaries, began with a list. They never called it a list out loud, they called it a playbook. Rule 1, no jealousy because envy is a bad editor. Rule 2, no sleeping over unless the trains were stalled by rain. Rule 3, no future tense. The future was a museum they were not allowed to walk into. You might think it was cynical. It wasn't. It was their generosity in a new shape, the only way they could be certain not to ruin the only good thing that made sense without negotiation. Boundaries, after all, are sometimes scaffolding. You can build with them until the building stands on its own. They adopted their pact in a place that felt like a confession booth, a rooftop greenhouse where an intern grew basil behind the studio. The city below was all light and noise, but inside it smelled like wet earth and carefulness. Mara said, "We're grown-ups," and Theo said, "Some days," and they shook on it like co-conspirators. They were good at it, at first. They learned which restaurant corners provided the most privacy and which quilts didn't tangle. They learned to keep their jokes intact in public, to arrive separately at a bar, to exit by different doors if the night demanded that kind of choreography. They learned to be 2 kinds of people with a seamless seam between them. And yet there is a strange truth. If you study anything closely enough, you fall in love with it. Mara became an expert in the history of his shoulders, the way they tensed when a client feigned uncertainty. Theo became a scholar of the back of her hand, of how it warmed when her watercolor pieces were praised, how it cooled when someone used the word cute to describe work that was not small at all. She kept notes they pretended weren't notes. I know because I read their faces, which are letters in a language only women who watch from the edges learn to read. Chapter 3, Drafts and Edits. There came a week when the studio felt like a stalled elevator. No one was panicking, but everyone was standing very still. A tech client delayed sign-off on a campaign that had eaten 3 weekends and all of Theo's patience. He laughed in the hallway then, and that laugh broke in the middle like chalk. Mara saw it. She knew the sudden frailty of bravado. She took him to a night market on the edge of the East River, and they ate noodles on a bench that used to be a boarding plank. The wind made little shapes she wanted to draw later. "Tell me what hurts," she said, and he told her about the full-body tiredness, how it had become a second skin he was afraid to take off. They didn't break their rules that night. They didn't need to. She just let him talk until the words chased each other into gentleness, until they were fond of him again and willing to behave. When he walked her home, an old man was playing the clarinet on a corner where the streetlights forgot to perform. Theo stopped to listen. "The bravest instrument," Mara said, because it sounded like someone learning to breathe after a long underwater. Later, in her apartment, she pulled old brushes from a tin and taught him to write his name in ink that bled into the paper like a spill of light. He tried to teach her how to solve a minor puzzle from a strategy deck, pretending it was simple. It wasn't. They laughed over it until their mouths forgot which were kisses and which were comedy. The next morning, Mara took a train upstate to sit with her mother, who had been practicing bravery in a different register. Crowds had become too loud for her, new doors too sharp. Agoraphobia is a kind of city inside a person. The good days were avenues. The bad days were dead ends. Mara brought flowers that looked like splashes of sky. She never told Theo about the way she took a deep breath before every visit, how she felt like a ghost entering a house that didn't know it was haunted. Theo, for his part, visited a younger sister who juggled 2 jobs and 2 joys, an 8-year-old son who collected coins and an upright piano with 1 stubborn key. He fixed cabinet hinges, read a chapter from a new book about coral reefs, and arranged his face into calm so that the boy would believe the world had a reliable center. He never told Mara that his father had taught him to make lists to keep the fear at bay, or that sometimes he still slept with a notebook on his chest as if it were a shield. 2 separate tendernesses. 2 private living rooms. 2 people building a bridge between them plank by plank and pretending it was only a raft. Chapter 4: The Storm and the Station. When storms threaten, cities brag about their resilience. People do too. A summer squall blew in with a talent for drama, slapping the skyline and canceling happy hours. The train stalled. The rooftop greenhouse fogged into a green lung. Theo texted Mara a dumb photo of the studio ficus leaning like it was gossiping. She sent a picture back of her hallway's puddle marching toward the kitchen. Rules are easy until they're rewritten by weather. Trapped for the night, they found themselves in his apartment, where the windows were so large they turned the storm into a panorama. The thunder made everything sound earnest. They cooked what they had: eggs, basil liberated from the studio garden, toast, and traded 2 lies for every truth, a game they used to keep seriousness amused. But seriousness had a way of yawning awake with them. Mara told him about the day the doorbell made her mother cry. Theo told her about the way his father's lists used to end, with love, as if duty could teach tenderness how to sign its name. Mara said she sometimes dreamed her paintings could be hung in places where people were kinder to time. Theo said he wanted to design something that didn't need a download. Then the lights went out. In the absence of electricity, the city remembered how to be ancient. They sat on the floor near the window and watched the rain write short stories on the glass. He reached for her hand the way people reach for a rail on stairs when they don't want to fall. The silence landed, soft as a new truth. No one confesses in 1 sentence. It took them an hour to say what they were not saying, that they had become each other's best friend, and that the friendship had been dressed in other clothes, that the rules were a charm that had run out of magic, that they were scared not because there was nothing there but because there was too much. At midnight the lights hummed back. And with the sudden presence of all that certainty, lit rooms, predictable currents, they became uncertain again. The spell broke into shards of practicality. "We should sleep," Mara said, and Theo smiled like someone returning a borrowed book. "We should," he answered, and the old choreography reclaimed them, each taking a different door out of the moment. The storm moved on before dawn. The city dried itself on every available surface, noisy and unashamed. They returned to work and pretended they had only misheard something important. Chapter 5: The Reckoning. It would be comforting to blame the project. Did come roaring back to life. A rushed delivery of approval, an impossible new brief, a launch party that was more glitter than plan. But the truth is that work was only a mirror. The fracture lived underneath. The launch, Theo met someone who looked like a solution. She laughed easily and didn't mind the way he checked his phone for emergency texts that never arrived. Mara, brave in black and silver, watched them from the safe distance of a bar where a bartender built a tiny city out of glassware. Across the room, a photographer captured Mara's smile and found the crack in it later as he edited, a thin line like a hair across a lens. They avoided each other for 3 days. On the 4th, Mara painted all morning and all afternoon, water pooling into constellations on heavy paper. On the 5th, Theo ran until his lungs confessed they were only human. On the 6th, they both arrived separately at the rooftop greenhouse because grief has favorite places. They stood among the basil and let the plants do the talking. He broke the silence first. "I think I messed up," he said, which can mean 100 different things but usually means only one. She asked, "Do you want me to be your friend right now or your translator?" He said both. So she translated. He had tried to prove their pact was still intact by auditioning for other people's futures. It had not worked. His heart had staged a walkout. She had done something similar, sabotaging a nice man who called on time by accusing him, softly, of being a door she could not keep open. They were not good at theater anymore. "You're allowed to love me," she said finally, like a hypothesis. "You're allowed to love me too," he answered, like an equation that had always been true. Neither of them reached for the other. They let the thought stand like a person in a doorway, undecided. I wish I could tell you that courage arrives when summoned. It doesn't. It arrives like weather without asking, showing up as a gust or a slow warming. It took them a week to set their stage. And they chose, with a theatricality that would have made any city proud, a public place to say a private thing. Chapter 6, The Bravest Word. Theo had an idea that refused to be quiet, a pop-up exhibit in a defunct train station near the river, a tunnel that smelled like iron and story. He had contacts, Mara had colors. They conspired with friends who owed them favors and with strangers who liked the way they asked. Together they would make a passageway of light and language, a corridor where people could walk through their own unsaid sentences. On the night they opened it, a small crowd gathered. Strings of borrowed bulbs cast shy halos. Painted panels leaned against old brick like letters against a chest. The entrance, a sign asked, "Write the bravest word you know." The station filled with chalk. "Home, begin, forgive, enough." Mara arrived in a jacket that made her look like a promise. Theo waited by the final arch, hands full of nothing but nerve. The plan, if you could call it that, was improvisation wedded to intention. They had agreed, without agreeing, to risk reality. He stepped forward and tapped a microphone that hadn't been used since announcements were about departures. "This started as a project," he said, voice steady only on purpose, about how to move through the unsaid. "We thought we were making an installation, but we were building a hallway to a sentence." People quieted the way people do when they recognize the species of moment they are in. Mara stood with a cluster of studio friends. One of them squeezed her wrist, a pulse acknowledging a pulse. "This is a story," Theo continued, "about two people who tried to keep the present tense simple. They wrote rules and called it protection. But along the way they forgot a fact about living things. If you tend to them, they grow beyond their containers. This corridor is for that, for all the overflowing." He held up a panel Mara had painted in washes of dusk. Across it, in careful ink, he had written a sentence they'd rehearsed with their hearts, not their mouths. "We were brave enough to make a pact. Let us be braver and break it." Mara walked toward him, her steps a series of decisions resolving into an answer. In every story we tell about love, there is a moment when the world sound turns inward so one word can be heard. She reached him at the arch where the chalk dust, the lights, the city, and the future met. "I always thought courage would feel like fire," she said, her voice carrying in a place designed to send voices away. "It feels like standing still and not running." She took the microphone and added, "Yes." No orchestra started playing. The city did not kneel. But the crowd, gentle conspirators that they were, applauded in a way that made the station's old bones remember what it meant to be useful. They watched two people replace a playbook with a promise. After they walked outside into a night stitched with river wind. They talked about what would happen in the morning, messy, ordinary, unglamorous conversations about keys and schedules, about edges and expectations. They didn't pretend it would be easy. They only agreed it would be real. I have told you this as a woman who knew them, who watched them mistype their lives and then correct the spelling without losing any of the poem. If you pass by that station a month from now, the chalk will be rain-thinned, the bulbs will be borrowed back. But the bravest word will remain, not written on a wall, but on two people who decided that love isn't the opposite of freedom, it is the practice of it. Some nights later, they returned to the rooftop greenhouse, now fragrant with late basil and the ambition of mint. There they made a new rule, their only one: speak honestly even when it's inconvenient. They sealed it not with a handshake, but with laughter, which is as binding as any signature when it belongs to the right two people. They left the rooftop not by separate stairwells but together, carrying between them the soft, substantial weight of a future no longer locked behind glass. If this tale moved you, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, give a like to the video, leave a comment telling me your favorite moment, and share the video with someone who believes in brave love.